Hey everyone, welcome back to another installment of the My Car series. What we're looking at here is my first Tamiya Hornet. This is my second overall RC car, and funny story about how this one came to be. You'll recall in the episode where I talked about my first RC10, which is also my first RC car ever, at least my first hobby grade one, that the car was picked up because someone asked me to repair it. They didn't want to pay for it and said, keep it. Well, comically, a couple of months later, that same kid who told me to fix the RC10 came over to my grandparents' house where I was playing with, ironically, the RC10. And he said, my dad has another car that he wants to sell. Do you want it? I said, sure. What is it? And he said, a grasshopper. So I said, okay. So he brought the car over and he said, $5. Sold. Needless to say, he never got permission to sell the car. So that poor kid's dad must have hated me. Nevertheless, here is the Hornet. Although this is technically my first car, at least the sum of its parts are my first car. Basically, this car comes down to the paradox of Theseus's ship. For those of you who are not familiar, it basically has to do where if you replace every single board on an entire ship, do you have the same ship? So that's what we have here, is a car where I'm pretty certain, so let's see, for a fact, the chassis has been replaced, the gearboxes have been replaced, the front A-arms are Empro. This piece here cannot be original because it's in too good a shape. Bumper's been replaced. Body is absolutely replaced. Shocks have been replaced. Perhaps the ESC is original. Nothing on this car is the same as when I got it. And the fact of the matter is that's a result of this thing just being well loved, let's say. I'll talk about these two bodies in a moment. For the time being, we are looking at my green Hornet body. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the original owner, or at least his son, told me that this was a frog. And for the longest time, I really had no way of looking that up. The car didn't even have the correct rear shocks. It actually had frog shocks missing the spring, and they were screwed directly into the transmission, not unlike the Grasshopper. It did have a black Hornet body, which I do have an image of on screen. The body is no longer with us, unfortunately. So it wasn't until quite a lot later that I realized, wait a minute, that's not a Grasshopper, it's a Hornet. So this body is doing nothing more than kind of calling back to that period in this car's life where I always thought it was a Grasshopper. I also do like green, and these custom decals are from MCI Racing. I did a couple of other bodies. This is the body that goes on my wife's Hornet. It's really cool. It's hard to tell. It's actually a little bit dusty right now. It's an iridescent Tamiya paint that is shot across the whole body, and then I painted the pink and the purple, and this is, again, it's not really showing too well. Maybe you can see it here a little bit. This body here was created in order to mimic the look of my Nico Turbo Panther. That's why it says Tamiya Hornet in this area here. That's why the 35 is here. And that is where the color scheme is coming from. And as you can see, the image on the screen right now kind of helps to illustrate that. Now, this car is upgraded. At the front, it does have the Empro zero offset front suspension, which is a direct bolt-on for the standard Hornet front suspension. These are UG front shocks, and there was a while there where these were heavily sought after. And I tell people all the time that, yes, they are quite attractive to look at, and they match the car's vintage because they obviously are vintage, but they are terrible shocks. They always leak. There's no way to change the O-rings. The shaft is incredibly flexible, and it's installed with this really weird way of basically clamping down the shaft on both sides using two screws, this one here in the front and this one here at the back. So yeah, they give a vintage look, but they're pretty bad. The zero offset double wishbone front suspension does take advantage of not cutting the body out, and you know, it does keep the camber gain at bay, and I'm kind of a huge fan of that. I love this front bumper as well. This is an SLS printed Empro front bumper, which really I made simply for the look of the headlights. I really like that overall look. I do have these vintage Nerf Bars. I don't know who makes them. I want to say UG or Parma, but usually you can find these in blue, and I was lucky enough to find these in silver. Rear shocks are also UG. I would have said that these were better, but I've found that almost every single one of my sets of these has had a bent shaft. So in many cases, I've had to replace the shaft just by basically making a new one. Wheels and tires on this car have an interesting story. I restored this car before Tamiya had re-released the car and at the beginning of eBay. So these are vintage, original, new old stock tires and wheels, and they're in pretty good shape, but I noticed that even though this car had been kept stored in a bag ever since then, they are starting to crack. So now I have been using them because we might as well just use them and consume them, since they're really not going to last forever. There's one additional upgrade that I did to this car, which is the Empro battery retainer. I am simply beyond the days of putting tape on the belly of this, or kind of weird little Velcro straps. I hate the idea of things looking hack. I want them to look like they came this way. This has actually not been painted. This is black from Shapeways, and with a couple of coats of low gloss black, you'll get a lot closer to this look. But to me, this is clean, this is tidy. It also gets rid of the slap of the trans, so it does have its articulation still. Let's remove the body on this car, and we'll see what electronics that we're still running. This is one of my few cars that is still running low band. This is 27 megahertz, I believe, anyway. The car has a Novak Polaris ESC, which is okay. I'm a huge Novak fan, but I have often found that these Polaris receivers can be a little bit glitchy. The Servo is a vintage Airtronics 94-631 Servo. It is starting to feel its age. It's a little bit sluggish, so I don't know how much longer that is going to last. We do, of course, have the fictitious mechanical speed control with Servo. The Servo is broken. This is another, actually a little bit of a newer Airtronics Servo, but it is not operational. Simply there because, again, I don't want to keep it in a drawer. This hammer is my all-time favorite Novak ESC. This was allotted to me back in the day when I was a team driver for Novak, and I feel that there is no better place than to have taken this out of my RC10 and plopped it into good old number 2 over here. The motor is also very, very nice. This is a vintage Tamiya RX540 Technipower motor. Really a fantastic motor. It has a remarkable amount of pep. I really like the unique end bell. It's a little bit dusty here because this car does get driven. This is a very early Hornet. So this is the model that didn't have the resistor cover, and that's why it looks this way. This is the original resistor and plate that came with this car when I first got it. The car does mostly have ball bearings. I just realized that the front wheel has bushings, and I don't know why that is. Anyway, we'll have to kind of get rid of those. But nevertheless, this is my Hornet. Let's go ahead and put a different body on it. I really like how it looks with this Nico Turbo Panther callback body, especially given the fact that the front is all yellow at this point. When we would go on vacations as a kid, this thing was always thrown in the suitcase. Mainly because it was a lot smaller and lighter than the RC10, and also because it wouldn't sound off the scanners at the airport when this thing would be going overseas.
Go, stop. Watch this. Car's coming. Later I'll fall into it for you. Woo, right into it. Oh, I'm reversing here. Sorry. All right. Right. Grab back over my car. Grab back over my car. There you go. There it is. Hey, come here. My car's stuck. Sorry, Mom. It was me. It was Ryan. This has been brought to you by MG Productions.
I've said this a million times. This is not a particularly good car. It is just an incredibly fun car, and that novelty has simply never worn off, despite having owned this car nearly 30 years. So my friends, thank you so much for watching, and we've got lots of cars to cover in these My Car series from Empro Engineering. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.